Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming this evening for our penultimate lecture in the lecture series for this semester. We still have one more lecture, and I will announce these presently. Just to remind everyone, next Friday we will be having, Thursday, not Friday, Thursday, November 21st at 7:30 p.m. In the Industrial Technology Building, room 101, the other building where we've been having lectures. We will have an evening celebrating the publication of the new book in the Armenian series from Fresno State called David of Sassoon, Critical Studies on the Armenian Epic, which was edited by our very own Professor Barlow Dermagogician, who will be speaking about the book and its contents, as well as the Dean, Dr. Vida Samyan, and myself will also be making some remarks. So we encourage you all to come to that, and that's next Thursday, November 21st at 7:30 p.m. And then, on a lighter note, we'd like to invite everybody to the Armenian Student Organization's holiday party, which will be Friday, December 20th, from 6:30 p.m. to 11 p.m., and that will be at the Holy Trinity Armenian Apostolic Church Social Hall. Tickets are for $20, and formal attire is required. And we're up in the ante. You should RSVP by December 13th. And there are flyers about this for all those who are interested outside as well, and you can pick them up. And they're also selling tickets, so anybody who wishes to purchase a ticket this evening and go out and get your new tuxedo, you can do that tonight. This evening, however, we will be addressing the question of the history of a region that all of us are familiar with, the mountainous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, an area that is contested to this day by the Armenian population there and the Republic of Azerbaijan. And we will have a bit of a historic context for the current conflict that is going on. We have two speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Arsen Saparov, who comes to us from the University of Michigan, where he's a lecturer in Armenian Studies and History. Dr. Saparov got his PhD from the London School of Economics, and he has been particularly concerned with the issue of the creation of autonomous regions by the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And he has a book that's coming out on that book shortly, and he has delivered many lectures and as well as published many articles on that topic. Our second speaker is Dr. Sanjian, who also comes from Michigan, but from the University of Michigan Dearborn. He unfortunately was unable to make it this evening due to hospitalization and illness. However, he did send his paper, so I will be reading that paper for him. So our prayers are with him, and that wish him a ansadzala, a full recovery. But we're also grateful that he was able to send his paper along. Dr. Sanjian is an associate professor of history at University of Michigan Dearborn, as well as the director of the Armenian Center there. He too received his doctorate in England at SOAS, at the School for Oriental and African Studies. So we will begin tonight's lecture with Dr. Saparov, and who will be speaking. Do you have the title slide? I don't have the title. For the borders of the South Caucasus, 1920. Yeah, the date of 1922. 2024. Okay, please welcome Dr. Saparov and his team.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you, Sergio and Barlow, for inviting me here, and I think the first time I have such a big audience for a public lecture. So I'm very, very happy about that. Originally, I wanted to make a talk about the creation of boundaries in the entire region of the South Caucasus, but then I kind of realized that the public will be probably mostly interested in Karabakh issue. So I decided to move away from this original broad approach to the South Caucasus and wanted to make a mix between the two. So I will start with a case study of Karabakh, and then I will try to get some broader similarities between the problems and conflicts in the region, so to say, to draw some comparisons, because this is usually what is being omitted. To start with, I'll start with what is usually seen as the cause of the problems in Karabakh, which is usually a historical approach, but which this approach usually sees everything in terms of just and unjust. So if you take the Armenian position, the Armenians would say that Karabakh was very unjustly given to Azerbaijan by Comrade Stalin in 1921. And if you look at the Azerbaijani position, they would say, well, this was perfectly justified decision to do so. I wanted to get away from this kind of approach, whether this was a just decision or unjust decision, and I wanted to understand why would this decision be taken. I mean, obviously we have this fellow, that's Stalin around that time, and this in a way takes this question why away, because Stalin is usually perceived as an extremely bad character, so obviously the bad character does a bad thing. But I wanted to understand if this guy was doing the bad things, what was actually the motivation that made him to do that. And when I started looking at this question, I realized that actually there were the whole bunch of decisions about whether Karabakh is part of Armenia or part of Azerbaijan, and I came to a conclusion that actually the Soviet leadership at least 4 times granted Karabakh to Armenia, and only 1 time granted it to Azerbaijan. So these are the 4 occasions during which this territory was granted to Armenia, and there is only 1 occasion during which it was granted to Azerbaijan, and this last decision kind of stayed. I'll go through all these decisions. You should probably be getting a handout with this, so you don't have to read from the script. But to start with, before we get into the decisions, because all of these are happening during the establishment of Soviet power, I need to give you a very brief background of what was going on in the region before that. I mean, I'm saying brief, and it's indeed very, very brief, because if we were to cover these 2 years of independence in detail, nobody would go home tonight. So my point here would be just very, very sketchy outline of the region. So the Tsarist Empire was involved in the First World War, and by 1917 the empire collapses, and in October 1917 the Bolsheviks came to power in St. Petersburg, and the whole thing starts to disintegrate. And the South Caucasus, again, it's a very long story. To make it very short, under the Ottoman pressure, they are forced to proclaim independence in 1918. So when they proclaim independence, there is one interesting thing. If you read the declarations of independence of all 3 republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, you will realize that actually not a single one of them says what territories they claim. So neither Armenians are saying which territories they want, neither Georgians nor Azerbaijanis. So this is completely absent from the decision making or from the Declaration of Independence. If you're interested, you can compare it to American Declaration of Independence, and it's very exact what territories are declaring independence. These guys were very obscure about that. Now the reason is that not because they didn't have anything in mind, actually I think they had very exactly idea of what they wanted, but because they were probably planning to grab more territories than they could. And I came to the conclusion that there were probably 2 principles at play at the same time. One principle was everybody was saying we're going to get for the province. So the entire province in which we are the majority will belong to us. On the other hand, which is fine because, I mean, within the province you have all these economic ties and administrative mechanisms already in place, so it's a very kind of convenient place or running a new state. On the other hand, every single side there was interested in preserving their own minority group, which was being left behind in the other province. Now, on the one hand, this looks like an incompatible principle because you would always have a minority living in another province, and that would lead to the conflict. And this is one of the provinces of the South Caucasus, which actually combines two conflicting regions that became a source of dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I'm not sure how many people here realize. Okay. So this is what would become later the territory of Karabakh, and this area is what is territory of Zangezur in Armenia. So again, I'm skipping a lot here. The outcome of this very brief period of independence, 1919-20, was mostly characterized by the conflict between Armenians and the state of Azerbaijan over control over these territories. The result of this confrontation was Azerbaijan-controlled mountainous Karabakh, this region, and Armenians retained their control over this region. The reason Azerbaijanis were successful in controlling mountainous part of Karabakh was probably a lot to do with geography of this terrain, because this region is facing towards Kura River, so access from Azerbaijan is much easier than access from Armenia. While Zangezur, on the contrary, is a very mountainous and difficult terrain to get into and remains under the Armenian control. But meanwhile, by 1920, by the time the Azerbaijanis established their firm control over this disputed territory, there were changes taking place in the Russian Civil War. By this time, the Bolsheviks won the civil war, and they appeared on the boundaries of the South Caucasus. And at the exact moment when the Azerbaijanis established their control over Karabakh, the Bolsheviks invaded and proclaimed the establishment of Soviet power in Azerbaijan. Once they established Soviet power in Azerbaijan, they began backing the Azerbaijani claims for these disputed territories. The reason they were interested in this region was because at this moment in history, there was the shortest route between the Bolshevik forces and the movement of Mustafa Kemal in Turkey was running across these territories. They didn't have access to the Black Sea, neither the Bolsheviks nor the Mustafa Kemal troops. And this was the shortest route. So they become very much interested in controlling not only Karabakh but also Zangezur. So during the summer of 1920, there were constant problems going on in Zangezur. The Bolsheviks tried to capture it. They failed, etc., etc., etc. Again, this is a very long story. I'm just skipping it very, very briefly. Once they failed to capture Zangezur in 1920, they had another development taking place in Armenia. At that time, by October, November, and December, Armenia came under the attack from the Kemalist forces, and that territory, that independent republic, was overrun by these two forces. On the one hand, you had Kemalists, and on the other hand, you had Bolsheviks. So the Bolsheviks, at this moment, capturing Armenia and basically saving whatever was left from the Republic of Armenia from falling completely in the hands of the Kemalist forces. And at this junction, we have the first declaration of Karabakh being granted to Armenia. And this declaration was made on November 30 by the leader of Soviet Azerbaijan, Nariman Narimanov, and it was published in a newspaper in Azerbaijan, and this is a not very good scan of this newspaper. So in this declaration, he granted this disputed territory to Armenia. And if you look at the Armenian, not textbook, but Soviet time publications, etc., 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 this is a very much cited document, and they say, well, here is an evidence that Azerbaijan gives us Karabakh, and this is the end of the disputed, end of the dispute in a way. Now the question is, why would Narimanov give this disputed territory to Armenia? Well, I don't think he gave that because of, he sincerely believed in the principles of coexistence of nations and friendship between nations, nor because he liked Armenians very much. The reason he gave this territory to Armenians was because the Bolsheviks forced him to do so. And the reason they forced him to do so was because their position in Armenia was very weak at this moment. So by forcing him to declare the belonging of this disputed territory to Armenia, they were boosting their position in Armenia at this moment. So that was the first instance during which the Bolsheviks forced Azerbaijan to give up this disputed territory. Now again, I'm skipping a lot of things here, but the Soviet Armenian government never acted on this decision to grant this disputed territory to Armenia. They were busy, first of all, dealing with the rebels, the Armenian rebels in Zangezur around here, and they didn't have any link between themselves and Karabakh. And the other thing that started very quickly, literally, within a couple of months of their rule in Armenia, there was popular rebellion against the early Bolsheviks, so they were very quickly overthrown and this whole matter was forgotten. But once they were overthrown, the Soviet troops continued their push towards Sovietization of the remaining parts of the South Caucasus, and in February 1921 they captured Georgia. So by February 1921 the entire South Caucasus was already under their control. The only part that remained outside the Bolshevik control was this territory of Zangezur, this one here, which still remained in the hands of the anti-Soviet rebels. In March they signed a treaty with Turkey, established the external boundary, and they can start dealing with the remaining problems in this region. And it is in this context that we have another decision on Karabakh. And this decision is taken by Politburo. I need to make a very brief explanation here. This is a body made up, I think, of 11 people, and Stalin was among them. This body basically was acting as a government responsible for establishment of Soviet power in the South Caucasus. They were in communication with Moscow, but they were very much independent and acting very often in violation of Moscow principles. So these guys were very, very powerful in deciding what is going on in this region. And on June 3, they make a decision that Karabakh should, that Armenian government should declare Karabakh belonging to Armenia. Now, again, this is very much cited document. You will find it in many books published in Armenia. And one thing that wasn't clear to me is why would Politburo publish this document? And one thing that kind of drew my attention was that this thing was usually published under number 5. So number 5, Armenian government is supposed to grant, publish that Karabakh, the disputed territory, belongs to Armenia. So let's start at me thinking, okay, number 5, so what is number 1, 2, 3, and 4? Maybe there is more. And that's actually in one of your handouts. That's the second document. And it basically lists all the decisions that were taken on this day. And yes, indeed, number 5 is Armenian government proclaims that Karabakh belongs to Armenia. But the rest of the document places it in a wider context. And this wider context makes it very, very clear that this decision was to be published as a part of the deal to bring the disputed territory of Zangezur under the Armenian control. So part of this parcel was Armenian government proclaims Karabakh part of Armenia, and therefore we shall undermine some legitimacy of these rebels. And there were some other points how to overrun this disputed territory. So this second decision was taken within the context of Soviet attempt to capture this disputed territory, this rebellious territory, the last area of anti-Soviet resistance in the South Caucasus. And then within 10 days, the Armenian government actually published, here is the document. And then within the 10 days, the Armenian government published finally a proclamation. That's a photocopy, well, not photocopy, photograph of this document. They published this proclamation that Karabakh belongs to Armenia. And as you can see, it's published in 3 languages, in Armenian, Russian, and Turkic in Arabic. So In a way, yeah, it's an official proclamation, but on the other hand, this is a leaflet. It's a propaganda piece. So they published, I don't know how many thousands of these, to be distributed in Zangezur in order to undermine the legitimacy of the rebels. So these are so far three instances during which the Soviet leadership granted this disputed territory to Armenia. And so far, let's try to understand why they never managed to grab this territory. So after the Armenian government published this document, they dispatched a guy, a commissar, to establish his presence in Karabakh. And again, remember, there is no direct communication between the republics, the Soviet Armenia and Karabakh, so they sent it through Azerbaijan. And the Azerbaijanis became extremely, don't want to say annoyed, but extremely worried about this development. On the one hand, you would think, why would they become worried? Because this is a central government decision, so they cannot do much about it. On the other hand, there is a very urgency in Armenians trying to install this commissar in Karabakh, and very much urgency in Azerbaijan to prevent this guy being established in Karabakh. Now, the reason for that was that the Soviet troops were preparing to start operation against the rebels in Zangezur. So, in the thinking of Azerbaijan, if they prevented the Armenians establishing themselves in Karabakh as official part of Armenia, they would still win the situation. The Armenians were rushing because the whole reason for granting Karabakh to Armenia would disappear as soon as the rebels in Zangezur would be defeated. So the Azerbaijanis managed to prevent the establishment of commissar, the Armenian commissar in Karabakh, and the whole thing was postponed until later discussion by the Discussion Bureau members later in July 1921. So in 1921, they gathered together in the evening, very late at night, Stalin being present there, and they decided this matter between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and they put basically two projects to be voted, and both projects turned against Azerbaijan, and members of the Discussion Bureau decided to award this disputed territory to Armenia. So it seems that this was actually the fourth and the last decision that granted this disputed territory to Armenia. The next morning, things have changed, and the same members of Discussion Bureau gathered together again, and they completely reversed the decision. So the Armenian explanation is Stalin must have been present, and he decided to intervene in the last moment and change the decision. Even if it was Stalin who intervened and forced the change of decision, why would he do that? And the only explanation I have is, by that time, Zangezur rebellion was crushed, and the whole reason why the Bolsheviks were prepared to grant Karabakh to Armenia has disappeared. And at the same time, the Azerbaijan still maintained its control over this disputed territory, and they managed to prevent the Armenians establishing their commissars there. So that probably was the reason why the Bolsheviks came to the conclusion that since the very reason to grant Karabakh to Armenia was tied and linked to developments in Zangezur has disappeared, we shall leave the situation as it is. So that was a decision taken, and once the decision was taken to sweeten the pill for the Armenians, they made the clause of introducing an autonomy in this Armenian populated part. Now here is a second interesting development, which is the decision to grant Karabakh an autonomy within Azerbaijan is taken on July 4th, 1921. The proclamation of the establishment of this autonomy comes in 1923. And when you read this, and this is the official date from which the Karabakh autonomy starts, but if you read this proclamation, it's very short, a couple paragraphs, very vague document. It says, well, we proclaim the establishment of the Armenian autonomy within Azerbaijan. There are no boundaries, no explanation how it's going to be functioning, etc., etc., etc. It's only a year later, in 1924, that they finally publish a very detailed document which outlines the boundaries and outlines how this autonomy would be run. So in my understanding, the difference between 1921 and the final proclamation of autonomy in 1924, 23-24, is a period of a very strong struggle between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis. One side is trying to get autonomy, the other side is trying not to grant autonomy. There is a lot of documents that show that there were different tactics that the Azerbaijani government tried to avoid granting autonomy. And nevertheless, it's very interesting, the Soviet government that in the previous years was extremely flexible. I mean, they granted this disputed territory to Armenians 4 times, so basically they're moving back and forth, but they remained very, very firm in a later installment and eventually made sure, despite the resistance from the Azerbaijani government, they made sure that this territory would be granted an autonomy. So in a way, I want to move to a very brief conclusion to what this case study shows us. It shows us several things. That number one, in my opinion, that the Bolsheviks were not these manipulators with a very long-term agenda. These guys were very interested in a very short-term solutions to their problems. They actually, in a way, it's a very kind of radical thing to say, but I find that these guys were actually trying to resolve conflict rather than manipulate and etc., etc., etc. The other interesting thing that emerges from this case study is that there is a pattern that can be observed all over the region, over South Caucasus, which is whoever controlled the disputed territory would retain this control under the Soviet rule. So this is the same case in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and in Karabakh. Georgia controlled these both territories and Georgia retained this control. Azerbaijan controlled the disputed territory of Karabakh and they retained this control. Armenia controlled the disputed territory of Zangezur and Armenia retained Zangezur. So there is a certain logic can be seen in a Bolshevik decision-making in this region. And now a very interesting one, the third one, which I think makes also sense, is that in Karabakh we have a very interesting situation in which the Azerbaijani government is facing a very hostile population sitting in the mountains. So this situation is advantageous for the Armenians in the Republic of Armenia and is disadvantageous to the Azerbaijanis. So they have to establish control over a hostile population sitting in the mountains. But on the other hand, the situation is completely reversed if you look at the geography. From the geographic point of view, Azerbaijan has so much better access to this disputed territory than Armenia. They basically have a railway going on up there, and then from the railway it's like half a day of a walk from the railway to Karabakh. If you look at the Armenian situation, and this map shows it's much better, you will see that Armenians have to go all the way across the mountains of Zangezur to establish any link with Karabakh. So in this case, the situation is completely reversed. If Armenians have advantage of a friendly population living in mountains, they have disadvantage of accessing this population. And this access matter eventually decided that Azerbaijan would establish control over this disputed territory, and the Armenians would not be able to establish this control. And that eventually decided that the Bolshevik decision-making in this case. I want to move away from this case study, very detailed, and I don't want to do very similar case studies right now for the other two regions. So I'll leave this as one example, and I want to look at some similarities or dissimilarities in the other regions which exploded in conflict in the South Caucasus. And these regions, I mean, they are shown on this map in red. This is Abkhazia, which is all the way up there. And this is South Ossetia, and this is Karabakh. So all these three regions were created as autonomous units in early 20s by the Bolsheviks, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, all these regions exploded in a violent conflict. And still, I think, well, I don't think, I know that Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia, so it still continues. So a very popular view of this whole situation in a Western, well, academic world is that These regions were created on purpose in order to establish the Bolshevik and Soviet control over the republics. So they have this leverage of having these minority groups having a special status. So whenever the republic misbehaves, they can start stirring up the minority groups. So that's a prevailing view of this, the creation of this autonomous region. The other one, which is less radical, which is less conservative view, is that actually they were not thinking long-term and creating them on purpose, but they were creating them because of the economic reasons. So basically everybody knows that the Bolsheviks were economic animals. They were very much concerned about the economic aspects of organization of the Soviet Union, etc., etc., etc. And this is the logic that went into the granting these disputed territories to Georgia and to Azerbaijan. Again, if you look at the map, you don't need to know much about the economy of this region, but you will see that, let's say, South Ossetia is much better integrated within Georgia rather than with the Northern Caucasus. I mean, it's separated from the North Caucasus by the Caucasian Mountains. Very similar situation is in Karabakh. Karabakh is separated from Armenia by the mountains. Plus, you have this argument that the nomads living in the lowlands of Karabakh would depend on their ability to migrate into mountainous part of Karabakh for the summer period. So from the economic point of view, this really belongs to Azerbaijan, and South Ossetia really belongs to Georgia. And, well, for Abkhazia, you can make a similar case that it was better integrated with Georgia, etc. So people argue that economic considerations were prevailing in granting these decisions. So my approach to this is slightly different. I wanted to distance myself from this, Stalin was doing it all the way from the 1921. He kind of knew that Soviet Union will collapse 70 years later, and all this will come handy. My approach is slightly different. I want to differentiate between two levels of decision making with regard to the boundaries. And I would call one level of decision making tier 1, which is allocation. So what I mean by allocation? Allocation is when a decision is taken that this territory belongs to you and that territory belongs to you. So it's very vague decision making. Okay, you have this, you have this. And if you look at that allocation here, you have to believe me here, this was taken very, very quickly. Karabakh is July 5th, 1921, and South Ossetia, I think, I forgot the exact date, it's again 1921, later than Karabakh, and Abkhazia is immediately after the Georgia was captured. So this allocation level was very, very quick. And then you have another level, the limitation level, during which they actually decide which territory, what this kind of territory means in terms of boundaries and on the ground. And this is actually much longer, and Karabakh is a very good example of that, because remember, the final boundaries and explanation what this autonomy means only appears in 1924. So what is it? Three and a half years after the allocation decision is taken. South Ossetia is a bit shorter, and Abkhazia is again similar to South Ossetia. So the delimitation period is much longer than allocation period. And the reason for that is that the governments of Georgia and Azerbaijan were resisting by all possible means against this imposition of implementation of autonomous status for these regions. And nevertheless, the Soviet government remained very, very firm in forcing them to accept and actually implement the creation of autonomous republics. Now, this is strange, right? Because on the one hand, when they were capturing this region, they were quite flexible. I mean, they gave Karabakh 4 times to Armenia, and they were changing their mind all the time, without much of a problem. And then suddenly they decide to be very firm in establishing the boundaries. For me, the only explanation is that once they captured the region, going back on their decision to allocate this territory and delimitate it would be seen by the weakness. Would be seen by the weakness both by the population within the autonomous region and by the republics. So in order not to show this weakness, they were very firm in forcing the implementation of this decision. The other thing which is very important, put yourself in their position. They capture this region, they don't have enough armies and troops to control it, and they depend on their control on the cooperation of Azerbaijanis, Armenians, and Georgians. So they cannot actually at will do whatever they want. They very much depend, they cannot implement their decisions whatever the decisions are. So they have to take into consideration the desires of the republics and local population that is in a place. And in this situation, they had more or less two options. Option one was, they just do whatever the population, the minority group wants. They separate the minority group from the claimant. So they would separate, let's say, Syria, Karabakh from Azerbaijan, South Ossetia from Georgia, and Abkhazia from Georgia. On the other hand, if they do that, they immediately will alienate the Republican governments in Azerbaijan and Georgia. And Azerbaijan and Georgia are much more important than these 2 or 3 little autonomous regions. So they cannot really do that. They cannot afford alienating important and powerful republics in this region. The other option is the one that would please the republics, which is to integrate these territories without giving them any special status. That's exactly what the Georgians and Azerbaijanis wanted about these territories. But they don't do that. The reason they don't do that is because they know these are territories which were experiencing very violent conflicts quite recently, and their idea of resolving conflicts is separation of people from each other. So they cannot actually alienate minorities by completely integrating them within the republics. And that leads us to the only sort of solution possible, which is you keep the control over these territories, but you have to give them autonomous status. And this autonomous status is the only solution that could only work as long as Soviet Union is existing, because the Soviet government is enforcing this solution. And that in a way explains why these conflicts start emerging when the Soviet Union starts to collapse. The Georgians see it's necessary to rectify the wrongdoings of the communist regime, and they basically plan to abolish the Ossetian autonomy, etc., etc., etc. So this story is a different story. I'm not going to go into it. Now I left out, and this is the very last one, I left out the economic consideration. What about economic consideration? How about this is not a purposeful manipulation by the Soviet government, but this is purely economic logic here, and there is a lot of arguments for the economic considerations. For example, Karabakh is so well integrated in Azerbaijan, it just wouldn't make any economic sense to separate it from Azerbaijan and give it to Armenia. Same goes for South Ossetia. I mean, how do you imagine this? Separating Ossetia, which is completely facing southwards towards Georgia from Georgia, and establishing links from North Ossetia, with North Ossetia. I mean, there are no roads whatsoever. My kind of response to that is, if we take the economic logic, then and look and apply it to the entire region, then it doesn't make economic sense. Because while these cases make economic sense, there are plenty of cases which do not make economic sense. For example, Zangezur is very poorly integrated with Armenia. It would be actually easier to integrate it with Azerbaijan. So, but they don't integrate it to Azerbaijan. At the same time, if you look at Nakhchivan is so much better integrated with Armenia. So again, this wouldn't make any economic sense to leave it part of Azerbaijan while it's separate from Azerbaijan and so much better connected to Armenia. So if you kind of follow this economic logic, yeah, there are cases which support it, but there are cases which are completely do not support it. So does it mean that economic case doesn't stand? I think it does stand, but on a different level. The reason is, I think it was on a different level, is because the Bolsheviks didn't see the region as divided into these small, tiny principalities that came into being when they captured the region. They saw the region as a one economic unit, as the entire South Caucasus. And in 1922, they started a process of merging all these three republics into one Transcaucasian federation that lasted until 1936. So yes, the economic logic was there, but economic logic was on a much higher level than these low-level autonomous units or republics. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say today. And is that what? Wow, that was quick. Okay.
Thank you, Arsen. As I said, we'll have time for questions after Ada's paper, which I will read now. It's called Irredentism at the Crossroads of Nationalism, Communism, and Diverging Interpretations of the Soviet Experience. The Armenian Diasporan Press on Mountainous Karabakh, 1923 to 1985. So this is basically an overview of how the Armenians in the diaspora reacted to developments in the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh between the years 1923 and 1985. The Armenian refugees brought with them into their new countries of residence in the early 1920s a nationalist ideology, which was pursued in the new conditions of exile by the three Armenian political parties, the Hunchakians, Dashnaks, and Ramkabars. These parties propagated the belief that the area of the Soviet Republic of Armenia, formed in 1920-1921, around 11,500 square miles, fell short of national aspirations. The territory of the historical Armenian homeland had been 6 to 10 times larger. Other segments remained under Turkish, Soviet Azerbaijani, Soviet Georgian, and Iranian jurisdiction. The Armenians of the diaspora promoted a national ideal to gradually restore Armenian political sovereignty over all these territories and encourage the eventual return of all Armenians residing outside these areas to their ancestral land to live together as citizens of one nation state. Armenians had varying attitudes towards the four states mentioned, and these different postures affected the range of strategies proposed to recover each of these territories. All agreed that Turkey was the major enemy, and that the emancipation of Western Armenia from Turkish rule was the most important task. On the other hand, the issue of historically Armenian lands in Iran was raised very seldom. This paper, which is part of a more extensive study regarding the Armenian quest for mountainous Karabakh in the Soviet era, will focus on the mountainous Karabakh autonomous region in Soviet Azerbaijan, and to some extent on the territories of the autonomous Republic of Nakhichevan, the area of mountainous Ganzak, also in Soviet Azerbaijan, as well as the region of Akhalkalak in Soviet Georgia. These regions had an estimated total area of around 4,000 to 7,000 square miles, and all, except Nakhichevan, still had Armenian majorities. They were described collectively as the internal lands, Nerkin Hoge, because they fell, like Soviet Armenia, inside the borders of the Soviet Union. We can say that they formed the second tier of Armenian irredentism in the Soviet era, in between the demands from Turkey and Iran. I will try to describe how the fate of mountainous Karabakh was tackled by the various Armenian diasporan publications, which represented the various shades of Armenian opinion outside the Soviet Union, during the period extending from the very early years of Soviet domination in Transcaucasia, when the region's political administrative map was constructed in the early 1920s, to the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. The absence of indices for most of these periodicals makes it practically impossible to compile a comprehensive statistical and quantitative survey of all items dealing with mountainous Karabakh over a period of 6 decades. I have screened a few key periodicals in full. Thereafter, the cross-references in the polemics published in other important periodicals from various diasporan centers were traced, especially for specific time periods, when mountainous Karabakh and the internal lands were a hot topic in the press. Moreover, there was an attempt to fill some of the apparent gaps in the narrative through the use of published memoirs, internal political party documents, interviews with activists, and so on. Therefore, there is still room to uncover additional primary material and further refine the conclusions of this presentation. From the early 1920s and until the death of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in 1953, the anti-Soviet Dashnak press was at the forefront of raising the Karabakh issue in the diaspora. The Dashnaks viewed the reluctance of Moscow to annex Karabakh and the other internal lands to Soviet Armenia as just another indicator of the communist policies inimical to Armenians and raised their voice loudly in this matter. The Hunchakians and Ramgavars, despite sharing the same irredentist objectives, were more cautious in this regard. They tackled this issue in public very rarely, and much less vocally, due to tactical considerations emanating from their support for and readiness to cooperate with the Soviet regime in Armenia. One such example was the cautious welcome of Hunchak, the essential organ of the Hunchakian party, then published in France when the new Soviet constitution was promulgated in 1936. Soviet Armenia became a full Union Republic of the USSR with this constitution, but the internal lands remained outside its borders. Another instance was when, around the same time, the Ramgavar activist Arsen Chobanyan, living in France, privately tried to encourage the Soviet Armenian leader Akhasi Sanjian to raise the same issue with the leadership in Moscow, but failed. Eventually, Sanjian was liquidated during the Stalinist purges in 1936, and Chobanyan became a persona non grata for the rest of the Stalin era. The post-Stalin Soviet leaders allowed more regular contact between Soviet Armenia and the diaspora, which made the latter increasingly susceptible to the subdued irredentist desires among the elites in Yerevan. Since this was already in tune with the dominant ideology in the diaspora, the period extending from the funeral of Catholicos Gevorg VI in Echmiadzin in May 1954 to July 1959 gradually witnessed increasing behind-the-scenes interest towards this issue among pro-Soviet, anti-Dashnak factions as well. They gradually came out and joined calls for the annexation of Karabakh and the other internal lands. Simon Simonian, the future publisher of the Beirut periodical Sput, and the Yerevan-based author Derenik Demirjan, Vazgen I, the new Catholicos in Echmiadzin, the Ramgavar party leadership in Beirut, including Barunat Tovmasyan, the party's leader, and Arsen Kitur, the editor of Ararat, the Hunchakian daily in Beirut, all played pivotal, though not necessarily interconnected roles in preparing the intellectual climate which made Karabakh and the internal lands part of the Ramgavar and Hunchakian political agendas, and a respectable topic in the non-Dashnak press. Simonian attended the funeral of Gevorg VI and discussed this issue when he met Demirjan in Yerevan. Vazgen I claimed these territories for Soviet Armenia in a memorandum presented to the Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Bulganin after returning from a pastoral visit to a number of the aspirant communities in 1956. The Ramgavars decided to pursue the issue in 1956-57, and Tovmasyan carried with him a memorandum on this subject during his secret visit to Armenia in 1957. Finally, Kitur talked about the internal lands in public during his public visit to Armenia in late 1958. Thereafter, articles by Arsen Kitur in Ararat in July-August 1959 and by Simon Simonian in Sput from August that same year instigated arguably the first ever thorough public debate in the diasporan press in the post-Stalin era on the necessity of demanding the internal lands and the efficiency of various means to achieve that objective. Subsequently, there was practically not a single year when this issue did not come up in the diasporan press, within one context or another. Periods of especially heightened interest were the following. A, the months leading to the 40th anniversary celebrations of the Sovietization of Armenia, scheduled for November 1960. B, the period immediately following these celebrations, which were finally held in May 1961. C, the publication in Sput in December 1963 and in the Dashnak press a few months later of a petition to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, drawn up by 2,500 inhabitants of mountainous Karabakh and Armenians from the adjacent regions in Azerbaijan. D, The months following August 1966, when information leaked out of Yerevan to the effect that the Soviet Armenian government had officially appealed to Moscow to annex Karabakh to Armenia, and that Moscow had reportedly responded positively, suggesting that Armenia and Azerbaijan should resolve the issue bilaterally, with Moscow approving any eventual agreement. And finally, E, the publication in August 1967 of a new petition emanating from Karabakh and describing bloody Armenian-Azerbaijani inter-ethnic clashes in the region. The Karabakh and internal lands issues were also tackled on a more theoretical level in tracts published by the diasporan political parties from the mid-1960s to explain their positions on Armenian territorial claims in general. Works by Kersun Aharonian and Giray Nairi, which fall into this category, were first published in installments in the Beirut press before coming out in book form. The internal lands were also touched upon in interviews given by Ramgavar and Hunchakian leaders to a few nonpartisan periodicals. After 1968, the space allocated to Karabakh and the internal lands in the diasporan press decreased noticeably. This should probably be explained through the decrease in pressure from the Karabakh lobby in Soviet Armenia, the most active members of which were now being persecuted by the Azerbaijani authorities and forced out of Karabakh altogether. A report in Azdak Shabatoriya, the mouthpiece of the highest executive body of the Dashnak party, published in 1969, that Soviet Armenian leaders had tried but failed again in Moscow to acquire Karabakh and other internal lands, elicited relatively little comment. An April Fool's Day joke, published in the Dashnak daily Aztak in Beirut in 1971 to the effect that Karabakh had been attached to Armenia and that the annexation of Nakhichevan and Akhal Kalak would follow soon, did excite a few Lebanese Armenians for a few hours, but later caused sharp criticism from all rival newspapers published in the city. A new petition leaked from Karabakh in 1972 did not generate much interest across the diaspora. During the negotiations leading to the publication of a joint communique by the three diasporan political parties on 14 September 1974, pledging to mark the 60th anniversary of the Armenian genocide together, the Dashnaks agreed to a Hunchakian suggestion that, starting from the date of the publication of the communique to the actual date of the anniversary, 24 April 1975, articles with an anti-Soviet content, including territorial claims regarding Karabakh and Nakhichevan, would not appear in their newspapers. Thereafter, newspaper readers in Beirut remained unaware of the purges against so-called Armenian nationalists in Karabakh in 1975 until the publication of novelist Sergio Khazadian's open letter to the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in 1977, which demanded Karabakh's annexation to Soviet Armenia. This letter, published in Beirut, first in Zartonk and later in Aztag, briefly made Karabakh steal the newspaper headlines. In November 1978, Ramgavar leaders visiting Yerevan were asked to publish abroad a new document related to Karabakh. It did not appear in Zartonk, but it is most probably the same source given by Ramgavars to local historian Zaved Meserlian to be used in his Armenian language book on the Armenian question, which was then in the process of publication. A long series of articles entitled On the Question of the Formation of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, published in early 1979 in the Ramgavar newspaper Baikar in Boston, Massachusetts, under the name of S. Kevorkian, obviously a pseudonym, was probably also related to the same document. Day-to-day interest in Karabakh and the internal lands remained minimal in the diasporan press until the second half of 1987. In the second part of this paper, I will compare the positions of the Dashnak, Ramgavar, Hunchakian, and Armenian communist newspapers in the post-1953 era. The following arguments were common in the discourse adopted by the newspapers of the three Armenian parties. A, internal borders did matter within the Soviet federal structure. B, the maximum extent of territorial demands from Soviet Georgia and Azerbaijan were pressed. C, the internal land should be annexed immediately to Soviet Armenia. This unanimity should be contrasted to the continuing disagreements between Dashnaks and their rivals throughout the Cold War years about the status of Western Armenia whenever liberated from Turkey. The Dashnaks did not commit themselves to the joint Hunchakian-Ramgavar demand that Western Armenia too should be annexed to Soviet Armenia and hence to the Soviet Union. D. Soviet Armenia should have full Republican sovereignty over these territories. There were no calls for granting, say, Achal Kalak autonomy within Georgia as some sort of compromise. The only exception to this uncompromising stance was the readiness expressed by a few Armenian publicists on a few occasions to maintain Nakhichevan's autonomous status because of its majority Azerbaijani population, but still under Soviet Armenian Republican jurisdiction. E. The annexation of Karabakh and Nakhichevan was more urgent and or desirable than the other internal lands, either in Azerbaijan or Georgia. F. These lands were historically part of Armenia. G. The Armenians were struggling to restore justice. H. Armenian claims were based on the principle of national self-determination and the tenets of the Leninist nationalities policy. I. Geography, ethnic composition, common culture, and even climate provided additional support to the Armenian claims. J. While the recovery of Western Armenia was a priority for the diaspora, it was obvious that little could be done to force Ankara to give these territories away in the prevailing Cold War conditions. In contrast, Moscow's hands were not tied internationally to solve the internal lands problem. The only exception to this line of thought was Dashnak activist Shavlar Tarigian's argument during a panel discussion held in the early 1970s in Beirut that these territories could cause an international problem because of their geographical and strategic location. The Ramgavar activist Kersam Aharonian too argued occasionally that the annexation of Nakhichevan and Karabakh to Armenia could alter the fragile balance on the Transcaucasian frontier, where the strength of the defenses against NATO was a Soviet priority. And K, Moscow was inconsistent in its championing of the principle of national self-determination abroad and its acceptance of continuing injustice at home. Zartonk and Ararat frequently referred to a few statements communist leaders, including Azerbaijan's Nariman Narimanov, had made soon after Armenia's Sovietization in late 1920 about Azerbaijan's readiness to cede Karabakh and Nakhichevan to Armenia. And Arsen spoke about these declarations earlier. However, these newspapers never deeply analyzed the political conditions under which these statements had been made, and they did not try to explain thoroughly why these promises had not been kept. There were also frequent references in all these newspapers to internal border changes within the Soviet Union in the post-Stalin era, without going deep into the circumstances behind each case. These changes were alluded to simply to argue that the existing internal borders were not sacrosanct and could be changed. In addition to these arguments on matters of principle, the newspapers usually agreed, with some variation, that the claims for the internal lands were also based on immediate need. Soviet Armenia suffered from a shortage of land. It could not sustain its growing population, let alone house all the Armenians who lived outside the confines of historical Armenia, liable to assimilation, and who would return one day to their homeland. The same newspapers argued that, on the other hand, both Georgia and Azerbaijan did not have large internal and external diasporas and did not suffer from a shortage of land. The implicit conclusion of such an argument would be that both Azerbaijan and Georgia could give away the territories claimed by Armenia at no economic cost to themselves. It should be noted that when the Hunchakian leader, Haratun Guzhuni, made a similar argument in front of Khrushchev in 1961 to the effect that only Armenians had a large diaspora, the Soviet leader replied that the Azerbaijanis would disagree with such a statement. Moreover, the newspapers expressed confidence that annexing the internal lands to Armenia would enhance harmony and friendly cooperation within Transcaucasia. There were, however, certain points of consistent disagreement among the rival diasporan political parties. The Dashnaks held the Soviets responsible for giving away these territories, while the Ramgavars and Hunchakians considered them innocent in this regard. The Ramgavars and Hunchakians laid the blame instead, first and foremost, on the enemies of Soviet rule in Transcaucasia between 1917 and 1920, i.e. the ruling anti-communist parties in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, the British and the Ottoman and nationalist Turks. The discrepancy between the letter of the federal Soviet structure, as enshrined in the Constitution, and the reality of centralized rule by the Communist Party, where Russians held most prominent positions, also led to differing attitudes among the diasporan parties towards the central government and or the Republican leaderships in Georgia and Azerbaijan. The Dashnaks held the Kremlin primarily responsible for the continuing injustice, strongly criticizing it. Soviet Russia, they said, was against the strengthening and future independence of Armenia. That is why it kept the country fragmented. For the Dashnaks, the Soviet-Turkish rapprochement of the late 1960s was very ominous for Armenia. The Dashnak tone got gradually milder thereafter. For example, in the wake of Khanzadian's letter in 1977, they made a clear distinction between the dissident movement in the Soviet Union and Khanzadian's reported desire to see a historical mistake corrected. Tsar Tonk avoided any direct criticism of the Soviet government. It argued instead that Yerevan deserved a favor from Moscow, which could induce both Azerbaijan and Georgia to concede the internal lands. Despite its unhappiness with the Soviet-Turkish rapprochement in the 1960s, Tsar Tonk saw it as a transitory phase. The pan-Turkish ideology, it believed, would pose an existential threat to Russia. Tsar Tonk also argued that the expansion of Armenian and Georgian territory was in Russian interests, and that any solution favorable to Armenia would generate gratitude towards Moscow and the diaspora. Ararat praised the Soviet experience more than others. It even argued that the Soviet-Turkish rapprochement was not against Armenian interests. Any rapprochement with Ankara might reactivate a Soviet role in renegotiating the Turkish-Armenian boundaries. When the diasporans would repatriate in large numbers to Soviet Armenia, Hunchakian leaders said, there would arise a need for additional territories, and the internal lands would certainly be recovered then. The Dashnak press was usually hostile to Azerbaijan and Georgia as well. It constantly ridiculed the term brotherly, used by the Soviets to describe relations among the Union republics. Attacks against Azerbaijan and its Communist Party leader were particularly harsh after the publication of the 1967 petition. Azerbaijanis and their leaders were said to all share the negative traits Armenians perceived in Turks, both Ottomans and Kemalists. Tsar Tonk wavered in its approach toward Georgia and Azerbaijan. From an initial readiness to differentiate their attitudes toward Armenia from those of Turkey, and an underlining of the necessity to maintain good relations with both, it gradually became more critical. Tsar Tonk argued from the late 1960s that pan-Turkism was still alive among some, though not all, Azerbaijanis. Ararat refrained from criticizing the Georgians and Azerbaijanis. It interpreted the description brotherly more like a desired objective than that the Soviet system would accomplish gradually. It also constantly avoided the term occupation when referring to the internal lands. Ararat hoped that this problem would be solved peacefully in an atmosphere of growing friendship and mutual consent. Attitudes among the three parties also differed as regards the communist authorities in Soviet Armenia. The Dashnaks were the least friendly, but even their hostile attitude softened as it became apparent gradually that the Yerevan leadership was pursuing the annexation of Karabakh behind the scenes as much as possible. The Dashnaks argued that the diaspora should raise its voice against injustice because Soviet Armenians could not do that. Up to the early 1960s, they dismissed the patriotism of their Armenian rivals in the diaspora. But this position also changed gradually in favor of calls for unified action. Tsar Tonk and Ararat, on the other hand, believed that the issue should be pursued in Soviet Armenia, and that diasporans should support the Yerevan authorities in this regard. The pro-Soviet newspapers in the diaspora consistently criticized the Dashnak approach as unconstructive, arguing that it might be counterproductive to continuously raise unnecessary clamor in the diaspora. The few Armenian language communist newspapers in the diaspora rarely touched upon the topic of the internal lands, and that only during moments when the issue was being hotly debated in rival publications. They reiterated the viewpoint that the Soviet system was not to blame for the internal lands being outside Armenian jurisdiction. As a rule, they criticized the raising of these irredentist demands in the press and questioned the motives and arguments of those who did, often suggesting that the latter served the imperialist cause. The communists had no problem, however, in encouraging diaspora and irredentism towards Western Armenia, in NATO territory. The limitations of time will prevent me, unfortunately, from analyzing in detail the position of the independent Beirut weekly Sputnik and its editor Simon Simonian, who carried high the torch of demanding the internal lands and outlined a unique position. I hope this will be expounded in my projected book or in a future presentation one day. I will conclude with a series of observations on the prevailing intellectual climate among the Armenian political and intellectual elites in the diaspora after 1953. Armenians in the diaspora, on both sides of the political divide, were not necessarily very careful when reproducing facts in their newspaper articles from Armenia's recent history, or those pertaining to its natural and political geography, when advocating the issue of the internal lands. They were also not persistent when gathering data about developments behind the Iron Curtain. The number of obvious factual mistakes, which appeared again and again in the press from the 1950s, diminished, however, as time went by. Actually, some of them were corrected in later years. Superlatives used frequently when describing the Armenians as the only aggrieved people in the Soviet Union can also be attributed to a lack of acquaintance by the newspaper editors with the Sovietological literature available in European languages this side of the Iron Curtain. Extremely few diasporans visited Karabakh or Nakhichevan during this period, and most of the rumors that made it onto the pages of diasporan newspapers emanated from second or third-hand sources in Armenia. The perceived continuing injustice against the Armenians was contrasted occasionally to the growing success of independence movements in Africa in the 1960s. Differences in approach were conditioned more by political orientation rather than by the place of publication. Indeed, newspapers speaking for the same party, but published in various countries, often reprinted each other's articles on the internal lands. Within this context, we should also note that none of the articles surveyed for this study made any comparisons with the experiences of the host society. The only exception to this trend is a footnote added by the editors of Husafir, the Dashnak newspaper in Cairo, on 12th of December, 1972. When reprinting an article on Karabakh, published originally in Armenia, a periodical published in Buenos Aires, the editors in Egypt compared the terrible crime of the Armenian deportations of the First World War to the crimes committed from 1948 to the present day by Israel and the Zionists, with the United States' assistance against the native population of Palestine. Israel was accused of trying to expel the Palestinians from their ancestral lands and replacing them with Jewish settlers. Finally, throughout the period 1953 to 1985, none of the articles dealing with the internal lands ever discussed the possibility of the future disintegration of the Soviet Union. During our research, we came across to only one reference where the possibility of the future breakup of the Soviet Union was raised. It was by Shavash Cherigin in the early 1970s. Thank you.